Okay. Hello. Um, Thank you for coming at this weird time. Uh, just gonna start. Well, unless there are any questions about the syllabus or anything like that. If you do have questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat or just speak up. All right. So, John Locke, dates are 1632, 1704. Um, I'll say a little bit about his life. I'm not a historian. I often say this in my classes. Um, so, I kind of approach historical philosophers first by reading their text and trying to understand it, and then like gradually get pulled into actually learning about something about them as people. Um, so, um, but I think everything I'm about to tell you is true, at least. So, yeah, early on, he studied medicine at Oxford, and he actually practiced medicine for a while. Um, he was also involved in a group of, so we would call them scientists. They call themselves experimental philosophers, centered around Boyle and Hooke at Oxford. Um, I th My impression is that he was very much like a younger hanger-on in that group. He wasn't central to it in any way, but he did, like when he talks about doing chemical experiments, as we'll see later on, I think he's speaking from experience. Um, so after he left Oxford, he practiced medicine for a while in London, and he ended up working for Anthony Ashley Cooper, who later became the first Earl of Shaftesbury. Uh, he was the grandfather of the famous philosopher Shaftesbury. That was the third Earl of Shaftesbury. This is the first Earl of Shaftesbury. Um, and he was a powerful and controversial figure in England for many decades. Um, so Locke first worked for him as a physician. And in fact, apparently, among other things, he recommended that he get an operation, which probably saved his life. So, after that, Cooper or Shaftesbury, as we call him, although he wasn't Earl of Shaftesbury yet, Shaftesbury, after that, always felt indebted to Locke. Um, And Locke worked with him very closely, and among other things, I mean, after he started working for him as a physician, but he ended up being his secretary. And when he was made one of the Lords proprietor of the colony of Carolina, that is, Shaftesbury was. So this was under Charles II, right? Charles II was the king who came back after the Restoration. Um, Cooper or Shaftesbury had actually, uh, although he started off as a royalist, he ended up like working with the Commonwealth government. I don't know how much you know about the history of England, right? But there was a civil war. They executed Charles I, um, and proclaimed a commonwealth. They didn't have a king. Charles II went into exile. During that time, Shaftesbury worked in the Commonwealth government, but after the Restoration, when Charles II came back, um, he worked for him, and he was kind of a favorite of the king. That's how he got made an earl eventually, and also got made one of the Lords Proprietor of the colony of Carolina, which was called Carolina because it was named after Charles II. Um, and so Locke also ended up becoming secretary to the Lords Proprietor of Carolina. Um, And as part of that, he helped write a constitution for the colony of Carolina, um, which is notorious because, among other things, it enshrined slavery, right? The colony of Carolina was going to be a slave colony. Um, the truth is that Constitution, it mentions slavery only a couple times, kind of as an aside, but the whole thing is set up. It's like an attempt to reform feudalism and make it stable, kind of like by preventing the lords from selling their estates and stuff like that. Um, it was never put into practice at all. It probably couldn't have been put into practice. I mean, it was feudalism. It had serfs and everything in it. Um, Presumably, Locke wasn't. I mean, that's certainly totally inconsistent with Locke's later political philosophy. This was much earlier, but presumably Locke himself wasn't really interested in promoting serfdom or whatever. He wrote what the Lord's Proprietor wanted him to write in this Constitution. Um, and there's more to be said about that. If I ever teach 144 again, as I say, the political philosophy course, I'll talk a lot more about um, this. And actually, I signed part of that Constitution to read in that class. But that's all I'm going to say about it for now. Um, the So what happened after the Restoration, right? Charles II was king, and then people started to suspect that he was secretly sympathetic to Catholicism. It turns out that's actually true. He was secretly sympathetic to Catholicism. We now know whether he really planned to bring England back under Catholicism or not is not as clear. But his brother, who became James II, because Charles II didn't have uh, offspring, he got his brother James was the heir, and James II was even more suspected of Catholicism. And this is what eventually led to the Glorious Revolution, the Revolution of 1688, where they kicked out James II and they brought in William and Mary um, uh, to be king and queen. Uh, um, Mary was like connected to the royal family, although she wasn't actually in line to inherit. But they replaced James II with her and her husband William of Orange. So in the run up to that revolution of 1688, Shaftesbury was now on the anti-king side. Right? He had uh, because it seems because he also was worried about Charles being Catholic, um, Shaftesbury like turned against him, and Shaftesbury became one of the founders of what was called the Whig Party, which was basically the anti-king party. And Locke was also involved in that, and Locke was suspected of being involved in a plot to assassinate Charles II. Now, in that case, I think historians believe that Locke himself probably wasn't involved in that plot. There was a plot. Locke probably wasn't involved in it, but some of his associates were. So he was in those circles. Anyway, he and Shaftesbury had to leave England. They went to Amsterdam. Um, and Shaftesbury died in Amsterdam, but Locke came back after the Whig side won out in 1689. So he lived in Amsterdam from 1683 to 1689. When he got back in 1689, very shortly after that, he published his two main works. So the two treatises on government, which is what I would teach in 144, was published in 1689, and the essay was published in 1690. Um, Presumably he had been working on them. I mean, I think we know he had been working on them for a long time before that, right? So large parts of them were written in Amsterdam and some probably even before Amsterdam. Um, okay. That's most of what I know and all I want to say about Locke's personal life. But I do want to add a couple things. One is that Locke has kind of two bad reputations. Um, like, first of all, he has a reputation for being maybe not too bright. Um, And second of all, he has a reputation for being somehow kind of nasty. Um, Now, I actually don't agree with either of those. Like I've having taught him for quite a few years now, I like every time I read him, I respect him more actually. I don't think he was stupid or nasty in any way. But I mean, there are reasons he got those reputations. Um, um, he writes in a way, and we'll be seeing examples of this soon. He writes in a way that sometimes makes it seem like he's thinking something stupid. And you have to pay careful attention to understand what he's actually saying. Um, and as for the reputation of being kind of nasty, uh, well, I mean, the involvement with slavery, although it was pretty indirect, I think has contributed to that in recent years. I mean, it's unlike Berkeley, who we're going to read next, who actually owned slaves when he lived in Rhode Island, right? I mean, uh, but I think before that, a lot of it was due to Locke's defense of private property. Now, I mean, this it's kind of weird because like everyone in this period defended private property, essentially, right? Um, Uh, Most people thought it was pretty clear that private property was a good institution. Not everyone, but um, uh, all the main philosophers, as far as I know. Trying to think of an exception before Rousseau was even ambivalent about it. Um, but nevertheless, I guess um, somehow Locke got a uh, reputation as a kind of bourgeois defender of the status quo or something like that. Um, that, that's not really true. He was actually pretty radical in certain ways. Um, um, but, and in any case, as I said, I mean, like most of us, I think most of the time also kind of agree that private property is a good idea, at least when it's our property and someone's trying to take it. Um, I certainly don't think that means Locke is kind of an evil guy. Um, all right. I mean, I'm just mentioning that because both of those things are out there. Some people seem to believe one, some people seem to believe the other, some people seem to believe both. Um, I'm gonna do what I can with the material in this course to try to dispel those impressions. Okay, so that was one note I wanted to make about Locke. And the other about his is about his writing style. Remember, I was planning I wanted to say something about this at the end last time, before you read it, but I ran out of time. But um, I mean, he's first of all, he's obviously the oldest of the authors we're reading. That is the farthest away from us in time. His language is a little bit different than ours. Um, I mean, I'll point out some of those things as they come up, but this uh, this edition has notes in back, and many of the notes are to tell you like what Locke means by some word when it might not be exactly the same as what we mean. So it is worth looking at those. But it's not just his vocabulary, his style is I think strange to us. Um, he ha the way he writes, I think at the time it was popular both in English and in German. It persisted a lot longer in German than in English. And I think it's really Cicero is to blame for all of it. But the idea is that the elegant way to write is to make every sentence into a kind of puzzle where like you can't really tell what it's about until you get to the end and you have to kind of figure out how all the pieces get together. And there's a lot of commas. I mean, they used more commas then than we do now. So you'll see commas in weird places. At least this edition has eliminated the weird capitalization. Um, Locke capitalizes almost every noun, again, the way they still do in German. Um, so it takes a little bit of getting used to. I mean, it's kind of the opposite of the way we're taught. What we're taught constitutes good writing, right? Like good writing is like simple, forceful sentences, that grab the reader's attention, and this is the opposite. Um, I mean, on top of that, he is kind of long-winded. As you notice, even though most of the reading for the course is from this book, probably, we're not reading most of the book because it's really, really long. Um, he's long-winded, and also he has a style of like beating arguments into the ground. So, like the innate principles thing in book one is a good example of that. It's not enough for him to just prove that we get our knowledge some way. He has to prove that we don't get it some other way. And he has to take the argument in favor of that. And he'll say, well, first of all, the premise of this argument is false. And second of all, even if the premise were false, the conclusion wouldn't follow. And third of all, even if the conclusion followed, it wouldn't help my opponent, right? That's the way he goes through things. So that leads to things getting long. Um, I've, spared you some of that, but not all of that by selecting only certain parts. Um, okay, those are all the general things I want to say. Um, are there questions before I go on? Okay, I guess not. So, so before I talk about innate principles, I have to introduce this distinction between propositions and ideas. Let me erase this. Um, which is really important to follow what Locke is saying, and yet I find by experience a lot of students find kind of confusing. And moreover, it's a version of a distinction like this that comes up in almost every course and always causes problems. So I'm going to do my best to explain it. Um, so the thing to start with, I guess, is this. So a proposition is something that can be either true or false. And Locke says there are two kinds of propositions, or there's what are strictly speaking propositions, which are mental acts, right? So it's like a thought that can be either true or false. And then there's verbal propositions, which are right, which are written or spoken signs for those mental acts. We'll talk. when we get to book three, we'll talk a lot about exactly how Locke thinks language stands for, what goes on in our mind and what it's useful for and what it isn't. Um, so therefore, I mean, obviously, I'm not going to write any mental acts up on the blackboard. I'm going to write verbal propositions, right? So an example of a verbal proposition is snow is white, right? So this is, I mean, this is true. If I changed white to blue or something, it would be false. Um, that this is an example of a proposition, and it's an example of the form of proposition that Locke usually has in mind, or perhaps always has in mind, and it's the traditional Aristotelian example of a proposition. It has a subject, it's about something, and it says something about its subject, right? So the subject is snow, and what it says about snow is that it's white. So it has a subject and a predicate. Um, Now, ideas are what the building blocks of propositions that can't themselves be either true or false, but that you need to make a proposition. And in this proposition, the words snow and white stand for ideas, what Locke calls ideas. So other versions of the same contrast are, for example, Kant's contrast between judgments and concepts. But the terms Locke uses are proposition and idea. He doesn't talk about verbal ideas, only verbal propositions. What you would call these words is terms. The subject term of the proposition and the predicate term, although Locke doesn't use that word that much either, right? That term means end. It's like the two ends of the proposition. Um, And Locke thinks of a mental proposition as an act of the mind in which it affirms one idea of another idea, right? So here's examples of ideas: snow, white. Now you see, just the idea snow is neither true nor false. I haven't asserted anything when I think that. I just think snow. You could say I'm thinking about snow, but I'm not thinking anything in particular about it. So I'm not thinking something that could be true or false. Whereas a mental proposition is an act of the mind where it takes one idea and either affirms or denies another idea of it. Right? So I take my idea snow and I take my another idea white and I combine them either so as to claim that one applies to the other or that it doesn't. Right? So like snow is not white. Is another example of a proposition. It involves these same terms, these same two ideas, snow and white, but rather than affirming, it denies. And obviously, if this one is true, this one has to be false, and vice versa. Um, so, uh, book two is going to be all about ideas, right? Book one is about innate principles. Book two is going to be about ideas. Book three is about words, and book four is about knowledge. So we're going to be hearing a lot about ideas. We spent a long time talking about ideas. The reason I'm making this distinction right away, though, is that it already comes up in book one, even though he hasn't really introduced ideas yet. He already starts talking about them. I mean, all he says about ideas at the end of the introduction And this is the only definition of idea that you're going to get. Um, this is book one, chapter one. And again, as I mentioned very quickly at the end last time, uh, in some editions of the essay, the introduction doesn't have a number. So it wouldn't be chapter one. Chapter one would be the next one, no innate principles in the mind. But as far as I know, in all the editions published in Locke's lifetime, I mean, I haven't looked at all of them, but I often look at the fifth edition, which is the last one published in his lifetime. Um, these the introduction is chapter one, and it is in this one that I ordered for the course as well. So anyway, so book one, chapter one, section 8, near the top of page 59, or well, bottom of page 58. Um, I must here in the entrance beg pardon of my reader for the frequent use of the word idea. He always italicizes idea, I think because he thinks of it as a foreign term, right? It's a Greek word. Um, must here in the entrance beg pardon of my reader for the frequent use of the word idea, which he will find in the following treatise. It being that term which I think serves best to stand for whatsoever is the object of the understanding when a man thinks. So when you think, what you're thinking about is an idea. Or I guess we should say at least one idea, because when you think a proposition, it involves two ideas. But that's all he says. And then he goes on to book one. And book one is about innate principles. And a principle is a kind of proposition. So it's made out of ideas. And that turns out to be important in some of his arguments. Okay, so what kind of proposition is a principle, or how does this issue about principles come up? Innate principles. Um, by the way, are there questions about anything I just said about ideas and propositions? Okay. So, um, so the overall purpose of the book is to ask, I guess, two questions. One is, on what basis does our knowledge rest? And number two, therefore, I mean, we can tell from that, what are the limits of our possible knowledge? What things could we possibly know, and what things are outside of our reach and we shouldn't try to know them? Um, so the book is about knowledge. I mean, it's also about probability, or what Locke calls judgment, which is um, a kind of opinion that we're sort of entitled to, but that falls short of knowledge. I'll talk about that more later. But Locke is much more interested in knowledge. What is knowledge according to Locke? Well, I mean, so first of all, knowledge is or involves some kind of proposition, right? Obviously, when you know something, what you know must be something that can be true or false. And if you do know it, at least this is what we philosophers always say about the verb to know, it must be true, right? That is, you can't know things that are false. That's being mistaken. That's not knowing something. So knowledge consists of true propositions. But just thinking a true proposition is not enough to make it knowledge, right? I mean, I might be guessing. I might accidentally think the right thing. We don't call that knowledge. So what else does it take? And there's various possible answers to that, but Locke, and at least almost always in this book, he's careful to use knowledge this way. Not always. Um, but for Locke, the extra requirement is very strong. It's called knowledge when um, we perceive with certainty that a certain proposition is true. And I'm putting that that I mean that word perceive has to be kind of metaphorical here, right? Because I'm not talking about something I actually see. Um, uh, but um, but I'm putting it that way. We perceive with certainty that it's true because the idea here is, and this is kind of something that Locke kind of has in common with Descartes and various other people, that um, this is a kind of certainty that means you can't be wrong, right? I mean, there's other things we call certainty, like not knowing of any reason to doubt something. So you could call that certainty. Or being really confident and not worrying whether you're right or not. You could call that certainty. But I mean, and you can obviously be wrong when you're certain in one of those ways. But here the idea is that the certainty comes because you perceive clearly and distinctly that the proposition is true. So it is true. And if it doesn't rise to that level, Locke won't call it knowledge, right? So, um, um, things that we normally call knowledge, like I know that a lot of people live in China. Um, have I been to China? No. Let alone, am I actually seeing a lot of people in China right now? No. Um, so could I be wrong? Well, yeah, for sure I could be wrong, right? I mean, even if there were a lot of people in China 10 seconds ago, maybe an asteroid just hit it, right? I mean, I could be wrong. Um, Nevertheless, we normally in everyday life call that knowledge, right? Like we wouldn't hesitate in the right context to say, yeah, I know a lot of people live in China. Um, but Locke is using the term in a stronger sense where that doesn't count. So almost everything that we normally call knowledge is going to be have a lesser status of probability. Or in other words, the limits on our possible knowledge that we derive here are going to be very narrow. There's not much we can actually know, but are some things we can know and they're important, and we'll see what they are. Um, so the first question before we get to that is, how do we know them? How do we know anything? What is the basis of our knowledge? And Locke's answer, we already know what Locke's answer is because he's an empiricist. So I'm going to erase all these ideas and propositions. Right. What is the basis of our knowledge? And Locke's answer is experience. All our knowledge is based on experience. This is what the word empiricism literally refers to, right? Empiria is the word that's translated as experience. So this is what makes someone an empiricist. They think all our knowledge is based on experience. And books 2, 3, and 4 are going to be explanations of how our knowledge is based on experience. But before he starts that, he wants to deal with what he sees as the main competitor. So the competitor is that our knowledge is based on innate principles. That is, there's certain truths that we're born knowing. We always know them. Um, and those truths are the basis for the rest of our knowledge. Um, Now, I mean, it's not clear, first of all, what that means, right? Like, what does it mean that we're born knowing them and we always know them? So, one of Locke's arguments is going to be to corner the um, um, proponents of this view into explaining it in a way that makes it impossible to maintain, which presumably wasn't what they had in mind, but Locke is going to claim it's the only thing you could have in mind. So I mean, that's what I talk about next, but first I want to say, like, it's not clear that this is the only possible competitor, right? That the only things my knowledge could be based on would be either experience or innate principles. Um, it's also not clear exactly who Locke is arguing against here. I mean, the rationalists do, in some sense, think that there are innate principles that are the basis of our knowledge, but certainly not, they certainly don't maintain the view that Locke is going to get these people to maintain. Um, so if he is arguing against them, he's trying to claim something like, this is what they really would have to mean if they were serious or something like that, because it's not what they say. Um, uh, when he actually mentions some people who are his real competitors, they're not famous rationalist philosophers. They're like people no one's ever heard of now. And maybe that's all those are the people he's talking to. Um, it doesn't matter that much because like the interest here is less in seeing, the interest for me here anyway is less in seeing like uh can Locke beat this person, whoever they are, but like what can we learn about what Locke thinks by the arguments he makes here? Um, so anyway, that's the purpose of the whole first book. The purpose of the whole first book is to rule out the competitor's view, the innate principles view. And then the other view parts, the other books, and Locke himself says that strictly speaking, this is superfluous, right? He says, like, the other three books show with by positive arguments that my view is right. So it's really, I don't have to show that the other view is wrong. It's definitely wrong because I'm right. Um, and moreover, he also argues, oh, this is a little harder to understand exactly why, but he says the burden of proof is on people who claim that our knowledge isn't based on experience. So really, he says I could have left this alone, but just for the sake of thoroughness, as I said, Locke always does, he's gonna like first take this competitive view and beat it into the ground before he starts explaining his own. Okay, so what is the competitor view exactly? I mean, first of all, what is or would be an innate principle? Right? I say would be because again, Locke himself thinks there aren't any innate principles. So you can't ask Locke to give an example of an actual innate principle because he doesn't think there are innate principles. But you can ask him, what would an innate principle have to be if there were innate principles? So, I mean, first of all, a principle is a kind of proposition, as I said before. So innate principles is not the same as innate ideas. Now, he is going to argue that we also don't have innate ideas. Um, but um, that's kind of at least in book one, that comes in as a sub argument against innate principles. The main question is about these propositions. Um, Okay, so it's a kind of proposition, but it's not any proposition. I mean, first of all, obviously, it would have to be something true, and it would have to be something that we know is true. to serve as the basis of our knowledge. I mean, how, I guess I should say, how is it going to serve as the basis of our knowledge? Presumably because it's going to be like an axiom, right? We're going to be able to take these axioms and deduce everything else from them. Or at least, I mean, you could also obviously have a mixed view, although he doesn't talk about that, right? That some of our knowledge is based on experience, but we also need innate principles. Um, but they're going to have to be fit to serve as axioms from which you can deduce the rest of our knowledge. And that's actually contained in this term principle. This is it. Oh, this is an E. This is a P. All right. Almost none of these letters are recognizable. All right. Um, it's contained in this term principle. Principle means first. Um, or first beginning, first thing, principium. Um, so like when we say first principles, like, try to deduce this from first principles, that's actually redundant. It means like first firsts. Um, so so these have to be things that we perceive with certainty are true and which can again serve as the first basis from the which the rest of our knowledge will be deduced, can serve as a foundation for our knowledge. So um, this is why, for example, Locke isn't worried about the possibility that perhaps we're born with some faint ideas of warmth or pain or hunger or something like that. Um, I mean, those ideas might technically be innate in the sense that we're born with them. Locke admits that, although he thinks if so, we acquired them in the womb, right? So they're not really a good example. I mean, they're not what people really mean when they say innate. But even aside from that, like, it's not going to do us any good to have like some vague ideas of warmth and pain. At least this is what Locke is thinking. Is this obvious? Maybe some people think this isn't true. But anyway, it seems obvious that we're not going to be able to build all of our knowledge on a foundation of some propositions like warmth is not pain, or something like that, which perhaps we were born knowing. Um, what we need, this is what he says in book one, chapter 4, section 2 on page 91. Actually, it's right after the thing about warmth and pain. Forbidding perhaps some faint ideas of hunger and thirst and warmth and some pains which they may have felt in the womb, there is not the least appearance of any settled ideas at all in them, that is, in newborn babies, especially of ideas answering the terms which make up those universal propositions that are esteemed innate principles. Um, it seems that now I don't know if somehow I feel like in those days physicians didn't usually deliver babies. I don't know if my knowledge is inaccurate. I guess that's not knowledge if it's inaccurate, right? Uh, I, I don't know but anyway, however it came about, Locke actually seems to have a fair amount of experience with newborn babies. He discusses what they do in several places. Um, in fact, like one of the things I like about Locke is he seems to have talked to a lot of different kinds of people. Um, he isn't usually just thinking about what a certain kind of person might possibly be like. He actually talked to them. Again, in the case of newborn babies, he didn't talk to them, but for example, he noticed that if you hold them, they'll always turn their eyes towards the light. He mentions that somewhere. Any case, what he says is if you look at a newborn baby and examine them closely, you'll see that they don't show any sign of having this kind of ideas that would be in these innate principles. What would be an example of one of these innate principles? So Locke usually mentions two examples. There's a few others that come in, but I guess I should say first of all, there are two types of innate principles he's going to discuss. Um, of supposed innate principles that he's going to discuss. Speculative and practical. Speculative is just the Latin version of theoretical. Right? The Greek word theoria was translated into Latin as speculatio. In both cases, I guess the root meaning is like to be a spectator, actually, like to be a spectator at a some kind of event. um, but they're both being used to mean these words are being used to mark the distinction I was talking about last time, right? Like a speculative principle is a principle for our uh, um, for our theoretical knowledge, for all our knowledge about what's true or false of the world. And again, if there's things that aren't in the world, for what's true or false about them too. um, those would be speculative innate principles, whereas practical innate principles are innate moral principles, right? Like things that you're born knowing that you should or shouldn't do. So um, um, chapter 2 is about speculative principles. Chapter 3 is about practical principles. And then chapter 4 comes back and says some more things about principles in general. Um, so the examples of speculative principles that Locke always discusses are one of them is whatever is. And another one is it is impossible for the same thing to be and not to be. Right? These are the kind of principles we're looking for. You can't, very general logical principles. You can't make those with the ideas of warmth and thirst and hunger. You need you need ideas like impossible, right? This is the predicate here, I guess. Well, no, I don't know how he would analyze this. Yeah, I guess the subject is for the same thing to be and not to be, but I don't know what he would say about that. It doesn't obviously have that subject predicate form, but in any case, it definitely involves this idea, impossible. And Locke says, um, babies are not born with the idea impossible. They don't know that. That is, they don't conceive of that, right? That is, they can't think either that something is impossible or that it's not impossible because they're missing the idea. So that if you're missing the idea, you can't form any proposition using it. Right? Like if you have the idea of snow and the idea of white, you can form the proposition snow is white, and you can form the proposition snow is not white, and you can decide which one you believe. But if you're missing the idea of white, let's say, then you can't think that snow is white or that snow is not white. You can't think that anything is or is not white because you don't have the idea. And he's saying babies don't show any sign of having the idea of impossible. I mean, I I certainly know, and I found this weird, but it seemed to be true that both of my own daughters, when they were very little, um, actually understood impermissibility before they understood impossibility. Like, like if they would say, I want ice cream, if you said, no, you're not allowed to have ice cream now, they would understand that. But if you said, we don't have any ice cream and the store is closed and we can't get ice cream, they would say, I want ice cream. Right? So, in other words, impossibility is actually hard to understand. I think Locke is right. Um, so, um, and that's a sign that um, this couldn't be an innate principle. Um, I think similarly, and this is also to understand how what some of Locke's arguments are going to work. Innate principles, to be effective, would have to be absolutely clear and distinct, right? So that one thing they would have to be that I already said is they would have to be fit as first principles to deduce all our knowledge in general from. So they had to be very general, fundamental principles or propositions. But another thing is we would have to be absolutely sure what they mean, because otherwise, everything we deduced from them, we wouldn't be sure what that meant either, and we wouldn't get any knowledge out of it. And so that's why, for example, Locke argued that identity, which I guess is involved in this proposition here, or whatever is, um, that identity, he says, never mind when we first acquire the idea of identity, uh, we're not sure what counts as identical. We disagree about it, right? And he mentions this example, which he mentions in other places too, of the of I think his name is Euphorbius or someone like something like that, who was supposedly a reincarnation of Pythagoras. And he says, are they the same man or are they different men? Right? And he says, I bet you'll find people who don't agree about that. And that's a sign that this idea of identity, they don't have very clearly and distinctly. Um, right. So this argument is in book one, chapter four, section four on page 92. Um, should I? Um, oh, now this isn't working. So I guess it doesn't matter if I should do it or not. Oh, no, it's not working. Hmm. It worked before. I have a document camera, and when I lecture from home, I like to show the text I'm talking about sometimes. But now, even though when I tried it before it worked, it seems to be broken. I mean, I know it hasn't been working right recently, but I thought maybe it got better. Oh well. Anyway, I'll just read it to you. Um, if innate ideas are not clear and distinct so as to be universally known and naturally agreed on, they cannot be subjects of universal and undoubted truths, but will be the unavoidable occasion of perpetual uncertainty. Right? Because, like, what different people and potentially what the same person at different times means by this principle will be different. So they won't be fit as um, foundations of our knowledge in general. So, I mean, you can tell from this already, and I think this will become clearer later on, that um, Locke thinks that the usefulness of knowledge is social usefulness. Um, that it's not just about one person finding things out and being certain about them. Um, so, like, if there's a um, if there are different truths that each one of us is sure of, then that's not a basis for knowledge. That's a basis for confusion in society as a whole. Um, that's speculative principles. As far as practical principles go, he says this is near the beginning of chapter 3, um, on page 76, chapter 3, section 3. Um, Practical principles derived from nature are there for operation and must produce conformity of action, not barely speculative assent to their truth. Right? So he says if there's going to be practical principles, that is, innate moral principles that everyone agrees on, then they're going to have sufficient force to make us follow them. That's what practical principles are for. um, just as speculative principles are to be the foundation of our communal knowledge, practical principles are would be for the basis of our acting in the right way with each other. If they don't do that, right? So in other words, if his opponent is forced to concede that yeah, everyone knows it's wrong to do X, Y, and Z, but most people do it anyway, Locke is going to say, well, that doesn't count as an innate practical principle because it's not really knowing that it's wrong if you do it anyway. Um, and I pause again and ask if there are any questions. There have been no questions at all today. Oh, yes.
Um, I think I remember I do see where you're coming from. Like I agree with you that it seems like Locke thinks that uh, if you don't follow if the innate practical principle is not generally followed by people, then it's not legitimate to call it an innate practical principle. But it also seems like he speaks differently in certain sections. Um, I think that there's one where he says, yeah, here we go. So he says it in chapter 3 that the principles of actions lodged in men's appetites would carry men to the overturning of all morality if not counterbalanced by moral laws that make following said appetites principles such appetitive principles less desirable. So it kind of seems like he does think that there are like innate appetites and there's a net necessity of moral laws. Um, and if those innate appetites would overturn all morality, then like couldn't there still be innate morality? Like if he's saying that they can
Okay, well,
overturn it.
I mean, two things. First of all, yes, he does think, and at some point he actually calls them innate principles. So I'm getting a little out of order here, but this is how I was going to begin the discussion of innate principles. But um, right, so he admits in that very section I was reading on the same page, page 76. Um, um, In fact, it's it's right after the passage I was just reading. Nature, I confess, has put into man a desire of happiness and an aversion to misery. These indeed are innate practical principles, which, as practical principles ought, do continue constantly to operate and influence all our actions without ceasing. Right? So there is something, and you can call it practical principles, and it's definitely innate, according to Locke, these principles that we seek happiness, which um, will turn out basically to mean pleasure, right? So we seek pleasure and we try to avoid pain. And Locke says everyone follows that, right? You don't find people saying, "Yeah, I know pleasure is good, but I just can't bring myself to seek it." um, right? He says those do operate constantly and universally, and you can call them practical principles if you want. Um, but then he says, but these are inclinations of the appetite to good, not impressions of truth on the understanding. Right? Meaning, so this tells us a little bit more what a practical principle would be like. We would always follow it, but not as a kind of like drive or appetite, but because we would constantly be focusing on the fact that what it said was true, and that would motivate us. That's what a practical principle would be like. Um, and if we're innate, that would mean that we're born knowing it and focusing on the fact that it's true and using that to guide us, right? So if the innate practical principle were do as you would be done by, or I think Locke actually says do as you would be done to, which makes more sense. um, if the innate practical principle were do as you would be done to, um, it wouldn't mean that you had an irrational like drive to always keep doing what as you would be done to. It would mean that whenever you were thinking what to do, you would focus on the fact that you should always do as you would be done to, and that would constrain your action. So, I mean, so that's the answer to part of your question. I didn't quite understand the other part. I mean, it's true, he says, that these innate appetites, although they are appetites for good, which as we'll see later basically also means pleasure, according to Locke, they are appetites for good. Um, Nevertheless, they're um, selfish appetites for good that have to be counterbalanced by some other incentive to make us social. And that's why we need a moral law. So, I mean, I'll say a little bit about more about that today, and then more when we get to the actual discussion of ethics later in the essay. Um, but um, but that doesn't mean that the moral law is innate. It means that it's really important that people learn it by the time they become responsible for their own actions. And that before that, it's really important that someone else be answerable for their actions, like their parents. Um, because otherwise they're like wild animals. Um, so does that answer both parts of your question?
Well, just to like sum up what I'd been meaning to get across, like he seems to be arguing against the idea of innate practical principles by saying that if there were innate practical principles, then um, people would not generally go against them. But then on the other hand, he says that if these sort of appetitive, what is it, impulses that people have naturally were given free rein, they would overturn all moral laws. So there seems to be like a tension there because like why would he say that like they would o overturn all moral law? Like he seems to be using moral in two different like terms there, unless he's trying to define like innate moral principles as something that you would never want to go against, basically.
Okay, I'm not sure. Are you saying maybe your argument is something like, um, if moral law can restrain these innate appetites, why couldn't something else act against an innate moral law?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Um, so I think the answer is going to be that moral law doesn't control our innate appetites um, externally, so to speak. It uses those very appetites to restrain themselves um, by establishing rewards and punishments. That's how
Oh,
law
okay.
in general works, according to Locke and according to most people, I guess, right? The way law restrains our actions is so, like, if I would get more pleasure out of taking your stuff for myself, the law says, well, you would get more pleasure by doing that until you remember the punishment you're going to suffer. And I'm like, oh, yeah, okay, I'm not going to take it. Right. So that's the way moral law restrains the appetites by using those very appetites. Right. It's because the moral law is now threatening me with a greater pain that outweighs the pleasure I was going to get out of um, following the first appetite I had. Um, it's not by counteracting something that's not of the nature of that appetite at all. So I mean, Locke is very serious, and again, we'll see this in more detail when he explains, the different kinds of moral law and so forth. That those appetitive principles are act constantly. So there's no point in trying to convince someone not to follow them. They always follow them. So the way to convince them not to follow them is to change the balance of pleasure and pain they're going to get from the action. And that means that a law has to have an executive, right? Like someone has to enforce the law. So, and I guess again, we'll see all of that later. Does that help?
Oh, yeah, that's perfect. That cleared it all up.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, back to what I was talking about before, which was what? Uh, oh, so I was about to go on to say something more about how innate principles would have to work. Oops, page just fell on the floor. Hopefully, I don't need it. Um, so innate principles would have to work by being quote unquote innate impressions. Um, I mean, right, impression, it's a metaphor, right? They're like impressed on our mind as a um, seal is impressed on wax or something like that. Um, what is the metaphor? How do we cash out the metaphor, as they say, right? Like, what is the literal meaning? So, Locke says, and this is book one, chapter two, section five on page 60. Um, Imprinting, if it signify anything, being nothing else but the making certain truths to be perceived. For to imprint anything on the mind without the mind's perceiving it seems to me hardly intelligible. right? This goes along with something he says later on in the same paragraph on page 61 about the words to be in the understanding, like what it means that a certain principle is in the understanding, principle or idea is in the understanding. He says, for if these words to be in the understanding have any propriety, they signify to be understood. So that to be in the understanding and not to be understood, to be in the mind and never to be perceived is all one is to say anything is and is not in the mind or understanding. So it's a contradiction, right? So he's saying that um, for principles to be imprinted in the mind, like the mind isn't literally a piece of wax. Well, maybe it isn't, maybe it isn't. I'll talk about the question of materialism, I guess, next time. But um, um, doesn't seem to be a piece of wax anyway, whatever it is, right? The mind isn't literally a piece of wax. It doesn't literally have impressions made in it. What does we mean when we talk about something being printed on the mind? Well, he says it means that the mind perceives it to be true in this case, right? That is, knows it. Um, so if you say something like, well, babies are born knowing that whatever is, um, but they just don't realize that they know it yet. Um, Locke will say, what do you mean they're born having it in their mind, but they don't know it yet? Where is it? Where else is there in the mind but the place where we know things, so to speak? Um, so um, this is the way a principle can be in the mind. This is what the innate principle people would have to claim. And so they have to claim something much stronger than what you might think, namely something like that we have innate powers or capabilities of knowing things. Locke doesn't deny that, right? There's certain things we're fit by nature to know, but we have to learn them. There's certain things that as soon as we understand them, we perceive that they're true. And Locke admits that these maxims are the kind of things that as soon as we understand the ideas that they're made out of and focus on the way they're trying to combine them, we see that it's correct and they're true. So you might say, well, why aren't they innate then? Well, because we have to do that. And we don't do it when we're first born. In fact, we don't even have the ideas when we're first born. First, we have to get the ideas. And then, which may never happen if we don't study philosophy, right? If we spend our life doing something useful, and then it has to occur to us somehow to put the ideas together in this way. Then we'll perceive that it's true, right? So we have uh, an innate power to know that it's true as soon as we understand it. But that doesn't mean that it's an innate principle. On the contrary, like every principle, we have to learn it. Um, right? I mean, so Locke does consider the possibility that when we say the mind has certain innate principles um, imprinted on it, we just mean the mind has the potential to know those principles. And, you know, this is presumably much closer to what his real opponents think, right? I mean, they don't actually think that babies are born thinking it is impossible for the same thing to be and not to be, or that the first time they have that thought, that what seems to be the first time they remember having had it before in the womb or something like that. Um, they mean that somehow they're naturally capable of it or something like that. But Locke says what Locke says about that, and this is again back on page 61, is that sure, we have the capability to know these under the proper circumstances, when we have the right ideas, when they're put together in the right way, etc. But he says that's true of everything we'll ever know. Obviously, we had the capability to know it. Since we actually know it, we must have had the capability, right? Um, Actuality proves possibility, as they say. Um, right, so this is near the top of page 61. No proposition can be said to be in the mind which it never yet knew, which it was never yet conscious of. For if any one may, then by the same reason all propositions that are true and the mind is capable ever of assenting to may be said to be in the mind and to be imprinted. Since if any one can be said to be in the mind which it never yet knew, it must be only because it is capable of knowing it. And so the mind is of all truths it shall ever know. Nay, thus truth may be imprinted on the mind which it never did nor ever shall know. For a man may live long and die at last in ignorance of many truths which his mind was capable of knowing. Right? So if this is what you mean by innate, then everything I ever will know was innate because I was born with the capability of knowing it. And moreover, all kinds of things that I never will know were still innately imprinted in my mind because I could have known them. I had the capability, right? I just never thought of that. So, which again is exactly what Locke thinks about these maxims, that most people never think of them. And moreover, he's going to go on to argue that that's fine because they're not very useful. Um, so, uh, right. So it doesn't mean that. So it means what? I mean, what is Locke thinking his competitors take this to mean? And like I used to think he he took them to mean that we're kind of constantly thinking these truths from the time we're born on. Like every instant we're thinking. I mean, because if you took it literally, right? The mind has to perceive it. You might think it means the mind has to constantly perceive it from the time it was born until now. Um, that obviously would be a very bad consequence for the patrons of innate principles because there don't seem to be any truths like that we're always thinking about. Um, at least, um, not if you think about thinking about things the way Locke does. Ray, I mean, Descartes and Leibniz will have other things to say about this. But I don't think he means it to be that extreme. I think what they have to say is that um, when we do think of them, as I was saying before, we have to always remember that we already knew them before. That's what it means to have something in your mind that you're not thinking about at the moment. It means you're not thinking about it at the moment, but when it comes, it's going to come with the mark of having been in your mind before. It's going to be a memory and not a thing you're just now learning. And he says these things don't have that, and they couldn't because, again, uh, um, that is, they couldn't always have had that property because there was a time when we didn't have these ideas. So the first time I thought this after I got these ideas can't be a memory of having known them before, because before I didn't have the ideas and so I couldn't think it. Um, so, but this is also like the fact that his opponents have to mean this by imprinting is why they land on this other property of innate principles, which at first they think is a strong argument for their position. Namely, that if principles are really innate, they should be universally assented or consented to, right? Everyone should agree with them. And again, it's because it's not merely the potential to know that, in which case you might think someone who hasn't realized their potential yet would deny it, right? But it has to really be in my mind so that, like, as soon as you remind me of it, I again perceive that it's true and I'll assent to it. So these principles have to meet with universal assent. Now, what does universal mean? Who counts? Well, Um, so like for example, cats don't count. That is, if the proponents of universal of innate principles come and say everyone assents to these principles, and I say, oh yeah, my cat doesn't assent to them, they'll say, no, 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 that's not what we meant. Everyone, who is everyone? So Locke says, at least this is the way I understand what he's saying. I mean, I guess maybe I should say this. Locke takes for granted that it means all human beings. Okay, what are human beings? How do we know what's a human being and what isn't? That's an actual live question for Locke. He's going to say a lot about that later. What is the idea that we have that actually corresponds to the word? Well, I mean, we say human beings, usually says men, right? All men. Um, If I talk about that word, wait, did I talk about that last time already? I don't remember. Or was it 100B? I remember recently giving my talk about the word man, but I don't remember when it was. In
I
any
don't
case,
think it was
I'm not
last
going to,
time.
what?
I don't think it was last time. I think it was
It was
100B.
100B. Okay. Well, I'm not going to talk about it now because I'm short on time, but I will. It's going to come up. Let me just say that in English, this word has always been double-edged, right? It's always been like a potential, there's always been an ambiguity to it. Or, yeah, you could use it to mean human being, as he's presumably using it here, definitely using it here, I would say. But it could mean men as opposed to women. Um, and I think Locke is very conscious of that because I think we'll get to a place we'll see that he actually uses that ambiguity. So it's not like it's not true that every time he says man, he's thinking and not woman. But on the other hand, it's not true that it's innocent. And it like he doesn't realize that it could mean that. It's something more complicated, which is why like for you couldn't fix this text by just taking every instance of man and replacing it with human being. All right, that's all I'm going to say about it for now. So, um, right. So Locke says all men, but I'm going to say all human beings. What are human beings? And what the answer Locke is going to settle on later is, but the word human being, what we mean basically is a certain shape of living thing. Um, we don't, for example, mean a rational animal, that being the traditional Aristotelian definition. How can we tell? Well, suppose, and he's heard a story that someone met something like this. Suppose there's a rational biped with feathers, like a rational parrot. What would we say then? Would we say there's a human being with feathers? Or would we say there's a rational parrot? And he says, we would say there's a rational parrot. Right? So, in other words, human being meant being shaped like a human being, having the kind of hair that, or whatever that human beings have, not feathers, not having arms and not wings, having a mouth and not a beak, right? All those aspects. That's what it meant, not rational. Because when I show you something that doesn't have those characteristics but is rational, you don't say it's a human being. So, what the proponents of innate principles are claiming, have to claim, according to Locke, is that every animal with that shape assents to these principles. Why do they have to? Um, and I should say also that once Locke determines that this is what human being means, he calls into question the moral relevance of that principle. Um, He asks why that's a morally relevant qualification. It's not clear that it is. Why is that shape important? So, but I think his thought is this is the part I'm feeling in for him that he doesn't say. I think he's thought that his thought is that these innate principle people, um, since they think we don't get these things by reasoning, they're imprinted in our mind. Um, they they must think that they come along with our nature, with human nature. I mean, after all, that's what the word innate contains in, right? I mean, it means inborn, but it's related to the word natura, nature. And that they can only, like, their only way of understanding what nature that is to refer to the biological species human being. Because again, they can't appeal to rationality because you don't need rationality to get these principles. So that's going to be the basis of his main objection to them. What looks like an argument for them, universal consent, is going to turn into an objection. And now, although I split this lecture into two because I always ran out of time, it looks like I'm going to run out of time again. I just naturally expand to fill whatever space I'm given. But anyway, um, I guess I'm going to skip over. There's one other thing which will be important later on, but maybe not so important now, which is that Locke thinks that an innate principle would have to be self-evident. It couldn't require a demonstration, and that has to do with what he thinks a demonstration is for. But anyway, I will talk about that when we get to demonstration of things, because I want to talk about Locke's argument against the argument from universal consent, right? So the opponents say, look, everyone assents to these. And you've just said that an innate principle would have to draw universal assent. So doesn't that show that they're innate? So in reply to that, he says two things. First of all, he says, and this is maybe the more decisive one, but he spends less time on it, right? He says, number one, I said that being innate implies assent, but not vice versa. Just because everyone assents to a proposition doesn't mean it was innate, right? Like take the proposition, fire is hot. So he says, that's not innate. We learned that by experience, right? You can see babies learning it. If they're unlucky, they learn it by being burnt. So it's not innate. And yet, everyone, at least every adult, of normal cognitive ability assents to it. So the fact that everyone assents to something doesn't show that it's innate, especially not if you can point to obvious experiences which would allow everyone to acquire it. But furthermore, he says, even if universal assent or consent did show innateness, that would still be an argument against you because these principles don't draw universal assent. For example, babies don't assent to them. And also, he says, idiots don't assent to them. Right? So by idiot, he means, and I think, I'm not sure about this, but I like, so now obviously idiot is a very pejorative term. Um, uh, but it comes from a Greek word, idion, meaning like special or private. I think originally this was kind of a clinical sounding euphemism for people who are cognitively disabled, severely cognitively disabled. That's who he's talking about. Um, and he says, you can't get them to assent to these principles. They don't understand them. So it's not true. They don't have universal consent. Now, again, right, like using those examples of infants and young children and quote unquote idiots depends on what counts as universal being all human beings, right? Because again, you couldn't use cats as a counterexample, right? You have to use something that the universal assent is supposed to extend to, but it doesn't. That's what he's doing here. Okay, I covered most of what I wanted to talk about, but I did want to say something about innate practical principles. I think I could say a lot of it in 3 minutes. Um, I mean, especially because I already said some of it before. Um, Ray Locke believes in what's known as as psychological hedonism, which is as opposed to ethical hedonism. Psychological hedonism is not the view that you should do what brings you pleasure. It's the view that you always, in fact, do what you think will yield the most pleasure. Now, I mean, it depends on what you're paying attention to and how far ahead you're looking and whatever. So it can be complicated what you'll actually do, but that principle constantly controls all your actions. The principle of seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. And this is why he says, and this is on page 77, um, book one, chapter three, whatever section that is. I didn't write it down. But yet I think it must be allowed that several moral rules may receive from mankind a very general approbation without either knowing or admitting the true ground of morality, which can only be the will and law of a God who sees men in the dark and has in his hands rewards and punishments and power enough to call to account the proudest offender. Right? So, what he's saying, and this is a foretaste of what he's going to say about ethics later in the book in general, he's saying that exactly what I said before. The only way a law can rationally constrain the will is by promising rewards and punishments that will outweigh the present temptation. And so, if there are absolute moral laws that always ought to govern our behavior, we can only know that by knowing that there actually is a lawgiver who has the knowledge and the power to reward and punish. Um, if not infinitely, then at least always more than whatever the temptation can offer. Um, and he says, uh, lots of people don't know that. Um, Not only that, lots of people don't even have the idea of God, right? On this way of understanding morality, to know you can think the moral principle without having the idea of God, but you can't know it's true without having the idea of God. Because to know it's true, you have to know that there's a executive of the moral law that has infinite power to reward and punish. Um, so he says, um, um, just the fact that many of these innate principles, and he says there's no principle that someone somewhere doesn't deny, practical principle, but just the fact that many of them, like you should keep your promises or things like that, have very wide assent, doesn't show that they're innate. And on the contrary, they couldn't be innate because many people don't have the capability of knowing that they're true. And that includes, again, children and idiots, and it includes people in certain other parts of the world that don't have that type of religion. Um, and he says it probably includes a lot of people right here too, who have never thought carefully about what they mean by the word God and have no idea corresponding to it. Um, okay, I should say a little bit more about that, but I won't because I've already gone 2 minutes over. And next time, so the ne our next meeting will be Friday afternoon, again over Zoom. And again, I apologize for this weird schedule, but I'll talk then about ideas, and I'll see you then, I hope. Bye.
Thank you.